Hey there, welcome back. So last time you created your application's database, and you also created a model so that you could interact with the database and retrieve objects from it. In this lesson, you're going to learn how real web apps are organized and add the third major component to your application, a controller. Alright, so to start, make sure that MAMP is up and running. I was just using mine, so I'm good to go. And then open up your application in Sublime Text. Again, this is very handy, so when you open up Sublime Text, if your project isn't already open, you can go to this project menu, recent projects, and here's my movies app right here. Alright, let's open up the routes file. So up to now, all the code we've written has been in this single file. But as you can imagine, that's not a good long-term plan. We've only even added a single page, if you don't count our test route here for our database testing, and the file's already becoming a bit disorganized, disconnected. So what if we were to expand this application to include pages of all sorts, say not only pages related to movies, but also pages related to users and pages related to theaters? You can see how it could start to get really out of hand. So how should our code actually be organized? Right now our flow goes like this. You enter a URL, which matches a root, which matches, say, our welcome page, and that, in this case, loads a view. That's a traditional flow. But in a full web application, for example, say one that includes all different kinds of pages, like I just mentioned, there's always a middleman in that equation. Instead of going from route directly to view, you go from route to what's called a controller, and that controller then loads the designated view. So what's a controller? A controller is basically just that. It's a middleman component that helps control the traffic in a web application and do any necessary processing that needs to take place between the time a user enters a URL and you display a page to them, such as you'll see in just a minute, retrieving data from the database. And it helps you determine what should be done, what code should be executed, and what view should be loaded when you request to view a certain page of a certain type. And similar to models, you create a single controller to handle each type of pages. Again, in our case, we're only going to be creating a single controller, and it's going to be called movie controller to handle our movie-related pages. Because in fact, we're only going to have one page in this application, aside from the welcome page, of course. But as you can imagine, in a more complex application, you might have pages of different types, like I just mentioned. Maybe you'd have movie pages and theater-related pages. So those would be controlled by, those two different types of pages would be controlled by two different controllers. Again, we're sticking with one controller for now in our simple application. It's going to be called the movie controller. All right, let's create our movie controller now to help organize and run our movie pages. So in this app folder, in HTTP over here, in this controllers folder is where we store controllers. So right click on this folder and hit new file, save this and name it movie controller.php. All right, and enter the following code. All right, so this is what a new controller file looks like. It's a class that we named movie controller. If you see before, we didn't talk about this before, but this extends controller is what tells it to use all of Laravel's built-in controller functionality, which is very helpful. So again, in Laravel, a controller is a class, and just very briefly, since we haven't touched on this yet, a class is a programming structure that's used to group together pieces of related code or functions. So in a controller, those various functions are used to power different pages in the application. And this will make more sense in just a minute. So you've seen functions before though. If we go back to our routes file, you can see here that everything that controls these different routes is a function right here. So let's go ahead and add a new function to our controller, and we'll call it index. So in programming, index is the common name used for a page which is going to display all of the objects of a certain type. So you might be guessing, and if so, you're correct, that this is the function we're going to use to power our movies page. All right, so let's go back to routes. Right now, this is what we're using to power our movies page. Okay, so instead of using this function that's defined right here inside this file, we're going to instead point this route over to this new movie controller, and more specifically, this index function that we just created. So let's start by taking all this code and cutting it and putting it in this function instead. Note how it's very important to keep things properly indented. So this code is all inside of this function, so you can see that it's all indented one from these surrounding brackets. It makes your code very easy to read, and you never want to be passed off code from someone else without proper indentation. It just makes it a nightmare to read it. So make sure you always properly indent your code. All right, with that said, so now we need to go back here. Let's remove this function. Instead of that function, we're going to add a new string that tells this route now to go to the movie controller's index function. So again, we just use the name of the controller, the @ sign, and then the name of our function, which is index. And if we save that and load up our movies page in our browser, okay. So, and this was actually a mistake that I missed in the previous lesson, so my apologies. If we go back over here, instead of just app, this should actually be a /app, because this leading / tells it to start out looking for things in this main movies folder. So we go from movies down to app, down to our movie model, which is right here. Okay? So if we save that, go back to the browser and refresh, there we go. There's the code that we're looking for. Okay, again, though, this works exactly as expected, but note that we only changed the organization of the code. We just changed this route and we told it to point to the function in our controller, but this function is executing the same exact code. But you can see how this organization is much cleaner and easier to expand moving forward. Okay, so our controller's in place. Now let's go ahead and create a view file to display these movies. In a Laravel app, view files are, if you recall, stored in this resources folder and views. And it's always good to create a subfolder in this views folder to store your different types of views. So we're going to right click on views, click new folder, and down at the bottom here, you enter the name of your folder. We're going to call it movies. And we're going to use this subfolder to store our new view. So right click on this folder and do new file, save this and name it index.blade.php. And I'll explain why it's blade.php instead of just .php in the next lesson. So hold tight on that. All right, and to start with, let's just add some simple HTML code to our new view. All right, so this is just a super simple HTML page, traditional HTML structure. In the body, all we have right now is just an H1 heading that says my movies. Okay, so this is the view file we're starting out with. So if you recall back in routes, this is how you load a view, using this return and then a call to this view function and then the name of the view. So over in our movie controller, let's start by commenting out these statements right here that print out our data. We can leave them there for the time being, but we're not going to really need them anymore. They were really just for testing. All right, so instead, let's load up our new view. So we'll do return view, and then in our case, we're going to use movies.index. Why movies dot? Well, because if you see, the welcome file over here is directly within the main views folder, but our index view is inside of our movies subfolder. So to designate that, to tell this view function where to find our file, we use movies, which is the name of the folder, dot index, which is the name of our view file. All right, so let's save all that and then refresh this again. And there we go, it's loading our view properly. Right now, it only has a title, it's nothing fancy, but it's working. So as you've seen, all view files are PHP files. They all end in .php. And PHP files are special because they're allowed to contain both PHP and HTML code. So let's test that theory out. Note that PHP code always needs to be surrounded by opening and closing PHP tags. So you've seen these before. This is an opening PHP tag. And these files are special, so they don't have closing ones, but I'll show you a closing tag in just a second. Needless to say, when you're working within a view, your PHP code always needs to be surrounded by opening and closing tags. All right, so as you might have imagined, we're ultimately going to want to pass these movie objects, this data that we retrieved from the database, to our view. Because when all is said and done, we need to use that data to print out, to display our different movies and their information. So how do we go about doing that? Well, it's very easy. We supply one more additional parameter to this view function, and that parameter is an array. So enter this code. An array, just briefly, is a data structure in PHP that lets you store multiple items together, and it lets you store them as a key associated with a value. So basically, it functions in real life as you can think of a dictionary. So if you were looking up, say, words and their definitions, you could have an array that looks like this. All right, so this is an example array, defining these two words, cat and dog. And there are ways, as you'll see in a second, to retrieve these values from an array. In fact, if we were to store this, we'll do a quick demonstration. In a variable named dictionary, we could print out the value of cat like so, using the name of the variable and open bracket, the name of the key, and then that's going to retrieve its associated value. So we can go ahead and do this. It's going to mess up our page for a second, but for the sake of demonstration, if you save all of this, go back to your browser and refresh, you can see that it retrieved the value associated with the key cat. Okay? Retrieved and printed out my lovable annoying pet. All right, so that's it for that quick demo. Let's comment those out and save that. So this is how, back to the view at hand, this is how you pass information to a view. You pass it via an array. You use a key associated with the values or objects or data that you want to pass. So we're going to use this key movies and pass our variable, which currently contains all of the movie objects we retrieved from the database. And that'll let us access in our view all of these movies using the variable with this name. Okay, so let's, for the demonstration, actually call this all movies. All right. So now, in our index view, let's go with open and closing PHP tags. We'll surround those, again, with pre-tags. And for demonstration, let's use that print R again, and we'll print out all movies. Again, like I said, you can grab this data with a variable named after this key right here. Okay. So this is going to, in essence, do the same thing that we were doing back over here, but within our view, so within our page. So let's save that, go back to our browser, refresh one more time, and there you can see all of our data is now printed out on our page. But again, this isn't exactly how we want our movies data to be displayed on this page. So how do we go about formatting them to create a real page? And that's exactly what we're going to cover next time in the final lesson. So stay tuned for that, where you finish your initial application and your movies page.